My mom called me ungrateful for years, until a neighbor handed me the note she hid. I'm Allison, and I used to believe my mother's stories about me more than I believed my own voice. Moving back home at 33 wasn't part of the plan, but life rarely respects plans. The house felt smaller than I remembered, especially with my mom's comments filling every corner. Still, I tried to keep the peace, unsure whether I was rebuilding my life or simply borrowing space again, wondering which version felt truer. Mom always spoke about me as if she were reporting community news, except the news never painted me kindly. At gatherings, she'd mention how much she provided and how little I supposedly appreciated. People nodded sympathetically, not realizing I was often standing close enough to hear. I didn't correct her. I wasn't ready for the confrontation that would follow, so I stayed quiet, hoping silence would eventually soften something between us. One afternoon, I overheard her talking to a neighbor about my attitude. She said I made everything harder than it needed to be, especially after moving back. I felt the words sting, even though I'd grown familiar with their shape. I pretended to look for something in a kitchen drawer, though nothing was missing. It wasn't the criticism that hurt most. It was the confidence with which she delivered it, as if the version she shared was undisputed truth. I tried to remind myself that she'd raised me largely on her own after my dad left. She worked long hours, often without thanks. Gratitude mattered deeply to her, maybe because she rarely received it herself. Still, it seemed like she needed more from me than simple appreciation. She needed a story where she was the giving mother, and I was the daughter who didn't measure up, a narrative she returned to often. Living with her again meant slipping into roles I thought I'd outgrown. She would sigh loudly when I cooked something different from what she preferred, or when I came home later than expected. Nothing explosive, just small signals that I wasn't meeting unspoken expectations. I told myself I'd adjust. I told myself it was temporary. But temporary situations can feel permanent when their weight settles slowly, day after day, reshaping your sense of self. Our neighbor, Mrs. Turner, often watched from her porch with a gentle concern that didn't need words. She'd known me since I was a kid and always treated me with a steadiness I admired. Sometimes she'd wave me over for iced tea, giving me a quiet place to breathe. She never asked intrusive questions. Instead, she offered small observations that made me feel seen, which contrasted sharply with how unseen I felt at home. One week, I applied for a program at the local college, hoping to finally pursue a certification in design. I didn't tell my mom at first because I wanted to experience hope privately, without commentary. When I eventually mentioned it, she brushed it off as another phase, the word she used whenever she didn't take something seriously. I tried not to let her reaction discourage me, but doubt crept in, tightening around every hopeful thought. Days went by, and nothing arrived in the mail. I convinced myself I hadn't been accepted. My mom commented occasionally, saying things like, "It's for the best," or, "At least you didn't waste money applying somewhere far." I nodded along, pretending I hadn't wanted it badly. I reminded myself I could try again later, even though disappointment lingered deeper than I expected, settling in quiet places I hadn't acknowledged before. Then one afternoon, I saw my mom at the mailbox with a look I recognized. Quick scanning, then something slipped discreetly into her pocket. She smiled when she noticed me approaching, saying it was just bills. I wanted to believe her, but something in the way she folded the mail made my stomach tighten. I didn't ask questions. I wasn't ready for what the answers might reveal, so I carried the uncertainty inside. The next day, while I was watering the porch plants, Mrs. Turner approached the fence. Her expression was careful, almost hesitant, as if she wasn't sure whether to speak. She held a folded paper in her hand and asked if we could talk privately. My heart thudded because her tone suggested something important. I followed her to her porch, unsure whether I felt nervous or relieved. Sensing a shift before understanding its shape, she told me she'd seen my mom remove an envelope from the mailbox and pocket it. She didn't want to assume anything, but the logo on the back caught her eye. "Allison, I think this was meant for you," she said, offering the paper gently. I stared at it, Recognizing the college emblem instantly, my fingers tingled as I accepted it, the weight of the moment heavier than the paper itself. I took the note to my room before opening it, needing a boundary between discovery and reaction. When I unfolded it, the words blurred for a second. "We are pleased to inform you." I choked on a breath. I'd been accepted, and with partial scholarship support. Relief and confusion tangled together. Then the timeline hit me. The letter had arrived weeks ago. Weeks I spent believing I'd failed, not knowing someone else had made that decision for me. Anger wasn't sharp. It was slow, a heaviness that filled my chest as I sat on the bed. For years, Mom insisted she knew what was best for me. Maybe she convinced herself withholding the letter protected me from disappointment or change. But seeing her choice written so plainly on that page made something inside me steady, rather than rage. It wasn't about punishment. It was about reclaiming a story I hadn't been allowed to tell. I brought the letter to Mrs. Turner the next morning, needing someone steady to witness what I was processing. She listened quietly, her hands folded around her tea mug. "Your mom fears being left alone," she said softly. "But fear can twist into control if no one challenges it." Her words didn't excuse my mom, but they helped me understand the emotional framework behind her decisions. Complexity doesn't erase harm. It just adds context. That afternoon, I wrote my mom a letter, one I rewrote several times before getting it right. I explained how her comments made me feel, how often I felt minimized, and what the hidden acceptance letter represented. I didn't accuse her of malicious intent, but I didn't soften the truth either. Writing allowed me to speak without interruption, offering clarity neither of us had managed in spoken conversations before. When she came home, I asked her to sit with me in the kitchen. I placed both letters on the table and slid mine toward her. She read it slowly, occasionally pausing. When she reached the acceptance letter, her face tightened. "I didn't want you to get hurt," she murmured. "You rush into things." Her voice wasn't defensive, just tired. I realized then that she wasn't expecting to be confronted. She was expecting to be obeyed. "I appreciate everything you've done," I told her gently, "but I need space to choose my own life. Protecting me shouldn't mean limiting me. It shouldn't mean deciding what I'm allowed to hope for." She looked at me, eyes glossy, as if hearing me for the first time instead of through the filter of her fears. It was the closest we'd come to honesty in years, and the air between us felt quieter. She didn't apologize, not fully. But she said, "I didn't know how to let you go without feeling abandoned." It wasn't the resolution I imagined, yet it opened something fragile and real. I told her I wasn't leaving to escape her. I was leaving to build something I could stand on. She nodded slowly, the beginning of acceptance forming in that small gesture, as tentative as it was meaningful. In the weeks that followed, small shifts happened. She asked about my class schedule without sarcasm. I shared updates without fear of being dismissed. We weren't perfect, but the edges softened. Mrs. Turner celebrated my first day of class with a small card tucked under my windshield wiper. My mom left a note on the counter that morning too, just wishing me luck, nothing more, but enough to show a shift in our dynamic. Starting school felt like stepping into sunlight after standing too long in shade. I wasn't trying to outrun my mother's narrative anymore. I was building my own. Some nights, I'd come home exhausted but content, my sketchbook open on the kitchen table. Mom would walk by, glance at my work, and offer a small, sincere, "That looks good." Those words, simple as they were, felt like an overdue acknowledgement. The acceptance letter now sits framed on my desk, not as a reminder of what my mom hid, but as a reminder of what I reclaimed. I've learned that gratitude doesn't mean silence. It doesn't mean shrinking yourself to keep someone comfortable. It means honoring where you come from while allowing yourself to grow. And sometimes growth starts with a neighbor handing you a note you were never supposed to hold. And in the gentle unfolding of change, I realized I wasn't ungrateful. I was finally becoming myself. I didn't open the acceptance letter again that next morning. Instead, I left it on my nightstand, letting it sit like proof of something I hadn't fully processed. I moved slowly around my room, Noticing how much of my adult life was squeezed into childhood space, it made me wonder how long I'd been adjusting myself to fit what my mom expected. I knew I couldn't ignore the letter anymore, especially with everything it revealed. At breakfast, Mom acted like nothing was different. She buttered toast, asked if I wanted extra coffee, and talked about the neighbors' recycling bins. I watched her hands move, steady and practiced, like she'd been rehearsing the same routine for decades. I wondered if she assumed I'd never bring up the hidden letter. That possibility unsettled me, because silence was the one thing I'd always given her easily, almost automatically, without question. I decided to go for a walk before confronting anything. Our neighborhood was quiet in the mornings, the kind of quiet that makes you hear your own thoughts more clearly than you want to. As I walked past Mrs. Turner's yard, she waved gently, not calling me over, just acknowledging me in a way that felt grounding. I appreciated that she wasn't pushing, even though she was part of the reason I now carried truth in my pocket. I kept hearing my mom's past phrases echoing while I walked, comments about responsibility, gratitude, and how lucky I should feel for having her. They were lines she repeated often enough that part of me accepted them as facts. But the acceptance letter complicated that. It was evidence of another pattern, one I hadn't allowed myself to examine closely. I needed space to understand what had been happening without immediately justifying her behavior. When I came back inside, Mom was sorting laundry at the dining table. She didn't look up when I entered, but I sensed she knew something was coming. I sat across from her without speaking at first. For once, I wanted her to look at me without accusations or assumptions. She continued folding towels, pretending not to notice my stillness, which only made the silence grow heavier between us, urging me to finally speak. "Mom, we need to talk," I said quietly. She froze mid-fold, her hands gripping the edge of a towel she hadn't finished smoothing. I heard her inhale sharply before she set it down. "About what?" she asked, though we both knew exactly what. I reached into my jacket pocket and placed the acceptance letter on the table. She didn't touch it. She simply stared at it the way someone stares at something they wish would disappear. "I know you took it from the mailbox," I said softly, not accusing, but not apologizing either. Her jaw tightened, and she leaned back slightly, like putting distance between herself and the consequences of her choices. "You weren't ready," she insisted. Her voice wasn't harsh. It was controlled, almost rehearsed, as if she'd prepared this explanation long before today. That made it hurt more, because it meant she'd justified hiding opportunities from me. Her reasoning spilled out slowly, laced with old fears. She said changing paths so often made me unstable. She said disappointment crushes me more than other people. She said she didn't want to watch me fall again. And somewhere between her words, I realized she genuinely believed these things. Not because they were true, but because she'd shaped her identity around protecting me from everything, including growth. That realization softened anger into something more complex. Still, I told her the truth. Protecting me shouldn't involve making decisions behind my back. Her eyes flicked up, meeting mine for a moment, and I saw a mixture of guilt and frustration. "You never appreciate what I do," she whispered. It was the familiar refrain, but this time I didn't shrink under it. "Mom, I do appreciate you," I replied. "But I can appreciate you without giving you control over every step I try to take." The towel she'd folded earlier was now wrinkled from her grip. She looked down at it as if it held answers. "I just didn't want to lose you," she admitted. It was the most vulnerable thing she'd said in months. But vulnerability doesn't undo impact. I leaned forward, my voice gentle. "You don't lose me by letting me grow. You lose me by making me feel small." Her eyes shimmered briefly, revealing she heard me more than she wished to. We talked for longer than I expected. Not smoothly, not kindly at every moment, but honestly. She admitted she'd intercepted other things over the years, mail she thought would discourage me, invitations she feared would pull me away, even opportunities she thought were too ambitious for someone prone to disappointment. Each admission landed heavily, reshaping memories I hadn't questioned at the time. I listened, feeling both anger and clarity rising in equal measure. When she finished, she looked exhausted. I felt exhausted too, but also strangely relieved. It was the first time she'd acknowledged that her fear shaped my life more than my choices did. I told her I didn't want to repeat that pattern, not for myself, and not someday for anyone who might depend on me. She watched me silently, processing a version of me she hadn't met before, one more willing to speak than to simply comply. After the conversation, I stepped outside to breathe fresh air. The sky had shifted into the soft blue of late afternoon, and the neighborhood sounded distant, like background noise. I sat on the porch steps, thinking about the years I spent believing my insecurities were personal flaws, rather than side effects of being overprotected and underestimated. The acceptance letter felt heavier now, not because of possibility, but because of everything it represented. Mrs. Turner appeared at her driveway, carrying a bag of groceries. When she saw me, she paused, offering a small, reassuring smile. She didn't approach or ask questions. She just nodded gently, as if acknowledging that something had shifted. Her quiet understanding steadied me in a way I hadn't expected. I realized I wasn't navigating this alone, even if the people walking beside me weren't family by blood. Back inside, I found Mom in the kitchen rinsing dishes. She didn't look up, but the air felt different, less tense, more contemplative. "Dinner will be ready in a bit," she said softly. It wasn't an apology, but it wasn't dismissive either. I nodded, sensing that small shifts often matter more than grand gestures. If trust was going to rebuild, it would require these small, cautious moments where neither of us retreated emotionally. While dinner simmered, I went to my room and placed the acceptance letter on my desk, smoothing its creases. Instead of thinking about what my mom hid, I focused on what I could now choose. The opportunity was still real. It still belonged to me, regardless of the delay. That realization sparked something, motivation not born from defiance, but from genuine desire to reclaim direction. It felt like the first step forward in years. Later at the dinner table, we ate mostly in silence. But it wasn't the heavy silence we used to share. It was an unsettled but open one, like a room awaiting furniture. At one point, Mom asked what classes the program included. Her tone wasn't warm, but it wasn't dismissive either. "Design foundations, digital tools, color theory," I answered. She nodded thoughtfully, and that simple nod felt like permission I no longer needed, but appreciated receiving. After dinner, she handed me leftover containers to store, but paused before letting go. "If you decide to go," she said quietly, "I want to help where I can." The offer surprised me, not because she was being generous, but because she was acknowledging my autonomy for the first time in a long while. I thanked her without overstretching the moment, letting it stand as a rare instance of mutual respect instead of a step backward. That night, lying in bed, I thought about how complicated love can be when shaped by fear. My mom wasn't malicious. She was overwhelmed by the idea of change. But understanding her fear didn't require sacrificing my future. I promised myself I'd apply that distinction moving forward. The house felt quieter than usual, as if making space for new possibilities, nudging me toward decisions I had delayed too long. Before sleeping, I texted Mrs. Turner a simple thank you. She replied with a heart emoji and, "Proud of you for speaking up." The words warmed me, settling gently into places where confidence had been missing. I realized then how essential steady people are during transitions, especially when those transitions involve redefining family roles. Her support didn't fix everything, but it helped me face what needed facing without feeling isolated. As I drifted toward sleep, I held on to one clear thought. Change doesn't always require dramatic breaks. Sometimes it begins with seeing yourself differently, choosing differently, speaking differently. And even though my mom and I had a long way to go, the first shift had happened. Tomorrow, I'd decide my next steps, with clarity instead of fear. And that felt like the beginning of a future I might finally allow myself to want. The next morning, I woke with an unfamiliar sense of steadiness, like something inside me had quietly rearranged overnight. I didn't feel triumphant or angry, just clear. I made coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and opened my laptop to check enrollment deadlines. Seeing the dates written plainly reminded me that this decision wasn't theoretical anymore. It required action. And action meant accepting that my life was beginning to shift under my own direction. Mom walked into the kitchen while I was reading through class outlines. She paused when she noticed the screen but didn't react immediately. She poured herself coffee, then sat across from me as if waiting for an invitation. Her silence wasn't the heavy silence from before. It was cautious, almost curious. I wondered whether she was preparing to question my choices or trying to understand them for the first time. I didn't know the program was this involved, she said finally, nodding toward my laptop. Her tone held no sarcasm, just unfamiliar uncertainty. I told her I'd researched it for months before applying, studying the structure, the instructors, and the job paths it could lead to. She listened in a way that surprised me, her hands wrapped around her mug. For once, I wasn't trying to convince her, I was simply informing her. She asked what had drawn me to design, and the question caught me off guard because she'd never asked before. I told her about the joy I felt creating layouts, colors, and compositions, how the process steadied me during chaotic years. She looked thoughtful, as if hearing this version of me for the first time. I sensed a shift happening inside her, small but real, something resembling acknowledgement of who I actually was. Before she left for work, she stopped at the doorway and hesitated. "Whatever you decide, I hope it makes you happy," she said quietly. That sentence wasn't an apology, but it was the closest she'd ever come to releasing control. Hearing it softened something inside me, not erasing the past, but loosening its grip. I realized we were both relearning each other, step by tentative step, unsure but willing. Once she left, I called the admissions office to confirm the scholarship was still valid. The woman on the phone congratulated me again, sounding genuinely enthusiastic. Hearing a stranger affirm something I doubted for weeks made me unexpectedly emotional. When I hung up, I sat on the couch, letting the reality settle. I still had a chance to begin, even if late. The delay didn't define me. The decision did. And that truth steadied my breath. Mrs. Turner knocked on the door mid-morning with a small container of muffins, pretending it was a casual visit. She sat with me on the porch while I told her about my conversation with Mom and the confirmation from the school. She listened with warm, proud eyes, nodding slowly as if she'd been rooting for this outcome long before I allowed myself to imagine it. Having someone consistently believe in me felt like its own kind of support. She told me she'd always sensed I needed a creative outlet, even when I didn't articulate it. "Some people grow when others step back a little," she said, squeezing my hand gently. Her words felt both comforting and challenging, reminding me that independence required boundaries I hadn't practiced enough. I wondered if I had been avoiding growth out of habit rather than lack of ability, and the thought stayed with me longer than expected. After she left, I spent the afternoon gathering documents I would need to enroll. Old transcripts, identification, financial forms, all pieces of a life I was stitching together again. Sorting through them felt symbolic, like collecting parts of myself that had been scattered over the years. Each page reminded me of attempts, failures, and restarts, but this time I wasn't viewing them as evidence of instability. They felt like stepping stones I could finally acknowledge. By late afternoon, Mom returned home carrying grocery bags. She placed a carton of my favorite yogurt on the counter, pretending it was coincidence. I recognized the gesture for what it was, a quiet offering, not a demand. She asked if I wanted help with dinner, and hearing her ask rather than instruct felt new. We cooked together in an awkward but peaceful rhythm, each of us adjusting to the gentler version of the space between us. While chopping vegetables, she asked how soon classes would begin. I told her the timeline, expecting tension, but she only nodded. "It's sooner than I thought," she murmured, not critically, just reflecting. I sensed she was processing her place in my life shifting, no longer the gatekeeper of every major decision. It wasn't easy for her, but she didn't push back. That restraint, however shaky, felt like progress worth noticing carefully. After dinner, she surprised me by asking if the program required supplies. I told her about a tablet I would eventually need for digital design work. She didn't offer to buy it, which I appreciated. Instead, she asked if there were cheaper alternatives or payment plans. It was the first time she'd approached my goals with practical curiosity rather than dismissal. Her questions felt like a bridge between us, fragile but real. Later that night, I sat at my desk and reopened the acceptance letter. This time, I didn't feel hurt or angry. I felt like someone standing at the threshold of a room she'd been afraid to enter. I ran my fingers over the printed words, absorbing them as evidence of capability rather than conflict. The future didn't feel guaranteed or easy, but it finally felt like mine to shape. That realization carried a quiet strength. Before bed, I checked my email and noticed a message from admissions sent earlier that day. They had updated my portal to reflect confirmed scholarship status and upcoming orientation dates. Seeing my name on official materials made the experience tangible. I took a screenshot for no reason other than wanting proof that this moment existed. It felt like marking a point on a map, where I stood now, not where I had been stuck before. In the hallway, I saw my mom lingering near my door as if unsure whether to knock. She stepped inside lightly and asked, "Do you need anything for tomorrow?" The question caught me off guard. I told her I was fine, but thanked her for asking. Her face softened, and for a brief moment, I saw not the controlling parent, but someone trying to reconnect. It gave me hope that change didn't have to be dramatic to matter. When she left the room, I wondered how many years we'd spent circling the same misunderstandings without naming them. Maybe both of us had been operating on outdated versions of each other. My mom still seeing me as fragile, and me assuming she'd never see me as capable. The gap between those perceptions had shaped our dynamic more than either of us realized. Recognizing that gave me a strange sense of compassion. I lay in bed thinking about boundaries I needed to build, not as walls, but as guideposts for healthier interactions. I knew there would be setbacks, moments when old habits resurfaced. But now, I felt equipped with something I hadn't had before. The willingness to protect my future without seeing it as a betrayal of my mother. That subtle shift felt like a foundation on which something sturdier could grow. I also realized how important it was to cultivate support outside family. Mrs. Turner's kindness had been a lifeline, grounding me with perspective when my home environment felt overwhelming. Her presence reminded me that support doesn't always come from expected places. Sometimes it's the steady neighbor who sees you clearly when your own household is tangled in emotional patterns you've stopped questioning. As I drifted toward sleep, I thought about orientation day. Sitting in a classroom again, meeting instructors, using tools I'd only read about. The idea made me nervous, but in a good way. Nervousness meant movement, and movement meant I was no longer letting fear, or someone else's narrative, define my direction. The day had felt long, but in a productive, clarifying way that made tomorrow seem less daunting than usual. Right before sleep, I whispered to myself, "I can do this." It wasn't a dramatic declaration, just a quiet reminder that small steps count too. I wasn't trying to reinvent my entire life overnight. I was simply choosing myself in ways I hadn't before. And as the house settled into nighttime stillness, I felt something settle in me as well. An emerging sense of ownership over the path unfolding ahead. Orientation day arrived sooner than I expected, and I woke with a mix of excitement and nerves twisting gently in my stomach. It felt strange getting dressed for something that wasn't work or an obligation, but a step toward something I actually chose. As I tied my shoes, I realized how long it had been since I prepared for a day that felt like possibility rather than survival. That alone made me pause and breathe differently. Mom hovered near the kitchen doorway as I packed my bag. She didn't offer advice or comments, which was unusual for her. Instead, she asked if I wanted her to drive me. I declined gently, wanting to begin this chapter under my own momentum. She nodded, looking both relieved and disappointed, a complicated mix I was starting to understand better. I appreciated the offer, though. It showed effort, however tentative. The drive to campus felt strangely peaceful. Morning light filtered through the windshield, catching dust particles that floated softly around me. I rolled the windows down slightly, letting cool air clear the last of my hesitation. Passing familiar streets reminded me of younger versions of myself, each one carrying dreams that felt too heavy or too unrealistic at the time. Now I wasn't chasing an old dream, but building a new one shaped by who I'd become. When I arrived, the parking lot buzzed with mild chaos. Students checking schedules, greeting friends, or standing nervously by themselves. I walked slowly, taking in the energy without letting it overwhelm me. I didn't feel old or out of place, as I feared. Instead, I felt grounded, aware of my age not as a disadvantage, but as perspective. I knew why I was here now, which felt like an advantage in itself. Orientation began in a small auditorium with folding chairs arranged in neat rows. I sat near the middle, avoiding both the front and the back. The coordinator, a warm woman with an easy smile, welcomed us and explained how the program supported students with varied backgrounds. Hearing her acknowledge non-traditional paths eased something inside me. I wasn't an exception here. I was part of the intended design, not an outlier. We split into groups to meet instructors and tour classrooms. Walking through the design lab, I felt a familiar spark. Rows of computers, tablets, color swatches, and typography charts pinned on corkboards. It reminded me why I loved creating. It wasn't about talent or future employment yet. It was about curiosity. I ran my hand lightly along a table, grounding myself in the simple joy of being where I longed to be. During a break, one of the instructors approached me after noticing my interest in the digital tools. He asked what brought me to the program. I told him honestly that I wanted to rebuild my life and needed a direction that aligned with who I was now. He nodded thoughtfully, saying many students felt the same. His calm acceptance reassured me that I didn't need a grand origin story, just willingness to learn. Walking back to my car afterward, I realized orientation hadn't erased my fears, but it had made them manageable. They no longer felt like walls, more like gentle reminders to move carefully. As I drove home, I practiced the conversation I knew awaited me. Not a confrontation, but an update. I wanted to share something good without bracing for disappointment. It felt new to imagine a version of my mom who could receive it without shutting down. When I got home, Mom was in the living room folding blankets. She looked up as soon as she heard the door. "How was it?" she asked, sounding almost neutral. I told her about the labs, the instructors, the schedule. She listened, nodding slowly, her hands pausing occasionally as if absorbing new information about who I was becoming. Her expression didn't shift dramatically, but it held something softer than usual. "I didn't realize it was so hands-on," she said after a moment. "It sounds serious." I told her it was, but in a way that felt right. She nodded again, this time with a hint of pride tucked into the motion. "Well," she added, "it sounds like you'll do well if you stay focused." The sentence wasn't perfect, but it wasn't dismissive either. It was her version of encouragement, and I chose to accept it as such. We ate dinner earlier than usual, and the conversation stayed surprisingly calm. She asked questions, not invasive ones, but ones that showed genuine curiosity. I answered patiently, aware that small steps mattered more now than correcting every old habit. At one point she said, "I wish your dad could see this." The comment landed unexpectedly deep, not because of nostalgia, but because it signaled she was seeing me as an adult with my own path. After dinner, I went to my room and spread my orientation materials across the bed. Reading through them again made everything feel more real. I highlighted important dates, circled supply lists, and started sketching a budget. The organization felt grounding, like I was preparing soil before planting something meaningful. As I worked, I sensed how much this moment contrasted with times when I felt directionless or dependent. A soft knock interrupted me. Mom stepped inside holding a small box. "I found this in the closet," she said quietly. Inside was my old sketchbook from high school, worn at the edges. "You were always drawing back then." Her voice carried no bitterness, only observation. I flipped through the pages, seeing versions of myself I'd forgotten. She smiled faintly and added, "Maybe it's good you're getting back to it." The comment warmed me unexpectedly. After she left, I sat with the sketchbook on my lap, running my fingers over the faded cover. It reminded me that creativity had always been part of me. Even during years I'd pushed it aside to meet expectations. Rediscovering it now felt like reclaiming a thread I'd dropped long ago. For the first time, I allowed myself to wonder what long-term growth might look like if I continued choosing myself day by day. Later that evening, I joined Mom in the living room while she watched a quiet TV show. We didn't talk much, but the silence between us felt different than before. Less tense, more spacious. I noticed she glanced at me occasionally, as if adjusting to the idea of me becoming someone she didn't fully shape. Instead of resenting the shift, she seemed to be studying it, trying to let it settle in her mind. Before bed, she approached me hesitantly and said, "If you ever need help with anything, rides, picking up supplies, just let me know." It wasn't controlling or conditional. It sounded like support offered gently, without strings. I thanked her. She nodded, turning away quickly as though embarrassed, but I felt the sincerity in her voice. It was a small bridge between us, fragile but promising. That night, as I prepared for sleep, I reflected on how different things felt compared to just weeks earlier. The tension hadn't vanished, and the past hadn't rewritten itself. But our relationship felt like a room where someone finally cracked open a window, air circulating, slowly shifting the atmosphere. I sensed we were learning to see each other again without using old, limiting lenses. Lying in the dark, I realized that rebuilding myself didn't require breaking my family apart. It required patience, truth, and room for discomfort. And though the path ahead remained uncertain, it finally felt like a path I was walking consciously, not one I'd been herded onto. That awareness deepened my breath, settling my nerves as I thought about what came next. I drifted into sleep, imagining my first real day of classes. New materials, new routines, unfamiliar challenges. Instead of dread, I felt anticipation, the kind that comes from stepping slowly but firmly into a life reshaping itself with intention. The idea didn't scare me anymore. It made me feel capable in a quiet, grounded way. The next chapter wasn't guaranteed to be smooth, but it was mine. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough to make tomorrow feel hopeful. The first official week of classes arrived with a quiet thrill I hadn't felt in years. Each morning I woke earlier than necessary, partly from nerves and partly from excitement. Walking across campus felt grounding, like I was slowly stitching myself into a life I'd once thought was unreachable. Every small achievement, the first completed assignment, the first encouraging comment from an instructor, became proof that I was capable of far more than the doubts I'd carried. Balancing school and home responsibilities required a rhythm I was still learning, but it felt manageable. Mom asked fewer controlling questions and more practical ones, which surprised me. She sometimes left a snack on my desk or folded my laundry before I got home. These gestures weren't about reclaiming authority. They felt like quiet attempts to rebuild something gently. I noticed, and I let myself appreciate them without reading too deeply into every detail. One evening, after finishing a color theory project, I found her sitting at the dining table sorting old paperwork. She looked tired but reflective, the way people do when confronting years of habits. She asked how my assignment went, and I showed her a printed version of my work. She studied it carefully, her eyes softening around the edges. "You did all this?" she asked quietly, not doubting, but genuinely stunned. Her admiration felt cautious yet sincere. I explained the techniques behind the design, expecting her to lose interest, but she leaned closer. She asked small questions, ones that didn't dismiss or diminish. This simple exchange, so normal for other families, felt like progress for us. I realized then how much I'd yearned for conversations where neither of us retreated into old roles. The moment wasn't dramatic, but it settled into me like a warm reminder that even strained relationships can shift. Over the next few days, our interactions carried a gentler tone. Of course, old habits resurfaced occasionally. She'd sigh too loudly or comment on my schedule as if it were hers to manage. But instead of reacting defensively, I expressed boundaries more clearly. Surprisingly, she listened. Not perfectly, but willingly. That willingness mattered more than immediate understanding. It meant we were learning a new way to be mother and daughter without suffocating each other. One Saturday morning, I woke to the sound of her humming softly while making breakfast. The melody was familiar, something she used to sing when I was a child. I joined her in the kitchen, still groggy. She handed me a mug of coffee without a word. We ate in comfortable silence until she finally spoke. "I'm proud of you," she said simply. No disclaimers, no conditions. The sentence landed deeper than I expected. I thanked her, trying not to let emotion overwhelm the moment. I sensed she wasn't used to saying those words any more than I was used to hearing them. She added softly, "I didn't realize how much I was holding you back. I thought keeping you close meant keeping you safe." It wasn't an apology exactly, but it wasn't avoidance either. It felt like acknowledgement, something I'd longed for without knowing how to ask. Later that day, I sat on the porch sketching ideas for an upcoming project. Mrs. Turner waved from her yard and asked how classes were going. I told her about the assignment and how surprisingly supportive Mom had been lately. She smiled knowingly, as though she'd been witnessing our progress from a gentle distance. Her presence again reminded me that families can be chosen in many shapes, not just the ones we're born into. As the semester unfolded, I found myself discovering parts of me I'd overlooked. Creativity wasn't just a skill, it became a way to understand myself. Deadlines, critiques, and revisions taught me discipline that felt empowering rather than stressful. Each completed project added another stitch to my sense of self-worth. Some days were harder than others, but even the hard ones felt purposeful. Unlike the stagnant years when I let fear dictate my choices, Mom adapted in her own slow, imperfect way. She still worried, sometimes too loudly, but she also stepped back more often. Occasionally, she'd knock gently before entering my room, a habit she'd never practiced before. Those small shifts signaled an emerging respect for the adult version of me, something I'd been quietly craving. I learned to meet her halfway, recognizing that growth for her was as challenging as growth for me. One evening, while reviewing portfolios with classmates online, Mom peeked in and asked if she could watch. I hesitated briefly, afraid of old patterns creeping back, but I agreed. She stood behind me, listening to feedback and observing the work I'd contributed. When the call ended, she said, "I didn't know your ideas looked like that." Her tone carried admiration and surprise, as though she were realizing I had an internal world she hadn't considered. That night we talked longer than usual. She reminisced about when I used to draw on grocery bags as a kid because we couldn't afford sketchbooks. I had forgotten those moments, but she remembered every detail. Hearing her speak from memory rather than criticism softened something between us. It reminded me that beneath her attempts at control was a woman who once encouraged my creativity, long before fear reshaped her parenting. As finals approached, stress crept in, tightening my shoulders and quickening my thoughts. Mom noticed and left small notes by my door. "Good luck today," or "Don't forget lunch." They weren't grand gestures, but they felt supportive rather than intrusive. I realized she was learning to show care without overshadowing me, and I was learning to receive care without fearing strings attached. That balance felt new, fragile, and meaningful. When grades were released, I sat alone on my bed, hands trembling as I opened the portal. Seeing high marks, especially glowing feedback on my design projects, made tears rise unexpectedly. Not because I doubted my ability, but because I had finally chosen something aligned with who I was. Achieving success on my own terms felt like reclaiming a part of myself I'd dimmed for years simply to keep peace at home. I walked into the kitchen holding the printed grade report. Mom looked up from the sink, startled. I handed it to her silently. She scanned it slowly, her eyes widening. When she looked at me, her expression wasn't performative pride. It was genuine, quiet admiration. "Allison," she said softly, shaking her head slightly, You did this. It wasn't said as a surprise, but as a recognition. That distinction mattered more than the grades themselves. We stood there for a moment, absorbing the simplicity of mutual recognition. Not mother versus daughter. Not protector versus dependent. Just two women, trying to learn how to love each other without controlling or shrinking. She hugged me gently. Not tight, not lingering, but in a way that felt intentional. I hugged her back, not as permission, but as acceptance that healing doesn't require perfection, just willingness. That night, I returned to my room and opened my old sketchbook, the one Mom had found in the closet. I flipped through childhood drawings and saw traces of the girl I had been and the woman I was becoming. I taped my new project beside those old sketches, letting past and present sit together without conflict. It felt symbolic, like stitching two chapters with a thread strong enough to hold without forcing them to match perfectly. As the house quieted, I stepped onto the porch and let the cool air settle around me. I thought about everything that had shifted, subtly, imperfectly, but undeniably. I wasn't the same woman who moved back home feeling defeated. And Mom wasn't the same woman who hid my letter out of fear. We were both learning in real time what it meant to trust each other again, while trusting ourselves differently. The future still felt wide, uncertain, and unshaped, but now it felt like mine to navigate. Not in rebellion and not in guilt, but with steady confidence built from tiny choices. I didn't know exactly where this path would lead, but I no longer needed absolute clarity. I needed only the willingness to continue. And that willingness felt stronger than any fear that once held me back. Standing there, I whispered a soft promise to myself. To keep choosing growth even when it felt uncomfortable. To keep drawing boundaries without resentment. And to keep believing in the version of me that had finally surfaced. And as the porch light hummed quietly above me, I felt something settle. Not closure, but beginning. And for the first time, beginning felt enough.